time to move on to the mainstream theory of the Sicilian Kalashnikov. So here after e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, it is very logical for white to go for the open Sicilian. After d4, c takes, knight e4, and e5. So the Sicilian Kalashnikov is quite similar to Sicilian Sveshnikov. The idea is to push away the knight from the center as quickly as possible, and you want to go for an aggressive game. You want to play moves like knight f6, sometimes bishop c5, bishop e4, sometimes d5 aggressively, trying to get a good development, while white is thinking how to make a good use of these weakened d5 and d6 squares. In practice proves that for white doing this, it's not very easy. So in this chapter 8, we're going to check all the side lines, right? The main move here, of course, is knight b5, which is going to be in the next chapter. But here we are going to check all the other side lines that white can choose. For example, white can play knight b3. Knight b3 retreat is quite typical in open Sicilians. White wants to play something like knight c3, perhaps, I don't know, bishop e3, bishop e2, and then have a pretty good pressure against your weakened d5 square. But there's one problem. After knight f6, white has some difficulties to properly react against your attack on the pawn on e4 and also the positional threat to push d5. For example, let's say white plays knight c3. Right? It makes perfect sense, but again, after bishop b4, the pawn on e4 now is immediately challenged, plus we are threatening to ruin white's pawn structure. After bishop d3, there is no time to wait, we can immediately play d5, take it, and knight e5. And if you get this kind of position, and the white king is still in the center, and there's also the spin on the c3, you should already feel the position is a complete success. After bishop d2, take it, b takes on c3, we can simply retreat to d6, because the idea is going to be playing at some point later f5, e4. The bishop on d6 is going to be very active, looking at the white king. So after the short castle, white's queen h5, we can simply push back with the move f5. So queen c7, bishop e6, rook a to e8. A black's position, to be honest, already looks better. Of course, knight c3 perhaps is not the best move, but how to protect the pawn on e4? White can play bishop d3, but now it doesn't stop your idea to push d5, and you should. So after d5, take it, knight takes on d5. Look at this, right? Black has achieved more than white and has a central pawn, while white doesn't have it. Short castle, and here actually black can be quite a bit ambitious. Instead of just continuing normal development, you can play knight b4, and you're like saying, I want more. I have a great position, but I want more. You want to get access to the last square bishop and get the two bishop advantage in an open position. So after bishop e4, we can simply take it here, and now white experiences some issues with the pawn on c2. Bishop takes on c6, knight takes on c6, and once again, black's position is simply better. You have two bishops, and you have the pawn center. So bishop d3 also doesn't look very impressive, but then what? Yes, sure, white can play bishop g5, right? Try to make sure that the pawn on e4 is defended by removing the attacker. But now the thing is, white gives up his very important dark square bishop. After queen f6, white has difficulties to play knight c3, because knight c3 to occupy the d5 square. Once again, you are just in time to play bishop b4. For example, bishop c4, takes, d6, we are going to play short castle, we are going to play bishop e6, and now you start to look at this position and realize this white knight on b3, it is completely placed in the wrong square, isn't it? Right? I mean, it should be standing somewhere on e3 so that it can control the d5 square. All right, so instead of knight c3, white can play bishop c4, and now we have a very nice move, once again, provocative move. So instead of continuing normal development, you can give a check bishop b4. I guess white is not going to play knight c3. He could, but then again, you are going to destroy his pawn formation. And after c3, now that the white knight can no longer get to the c3 and eventually the d5 square, now we play bishop e7. Castles, castles, and the white knight cannot easily get to the d5. So for example, white plays something like a4, here, queen e2, d6, knight e2. He has a very, very long route to get to the d5 square. We can play king h8 and be very aggressive at the king side, which is quite common idea of the Sicilian Kalashnikov, right? King h8, f5, and utilize the power of the two bishops. If white doesn't take this pawn, you can start quite a typical king side attack. Think about queen f6, g5, h5, g4, perhaps in some scenarios even bishop d8. Bishop b6 could be an option here to consider, right? And this bishop on b6 is very active. Right, so perhaps this knight b3 wasn't really such a good retreat. Now the question is what white should do. Of course, there's some other moves for white to retreat as well, right? For example, white can play also knight f3. After knight f3, we can play knight f6, and again, the same issues for white. He has to do something with his pawn on e4. For example, he plays knight c3, and again, we play bishop b4. Trying to press the center as hard as we can. Knight e4 is a threat. d5 might be a threat depending on what white is going to do. For example, white plays bishop d3. Now we can destroy his pawn center. Takes, takes. And a more careful move here is just to play d6. So white cannot really get to this pawn on d6 easily, because bishop a3 would be very nice pressure, but the queen's d file already is locked by this bishop on d3. So for example, castles, castles, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4. White tries to keep the spin alive, but we just play bishop e6. Ignore it, play rook c8 and knight a5. And if white wants to play something like knight e2 and play f4, this might be a good moment to play g5. So make sure if you don't play g5 early, because there might be a very unpleasant knight sacrifice on g5, and the spin on h4 d8 could cost you quite a bit. So don't play g5 just as long as the white knight is on f3. Let's go back here. Instead of bishop d3, white can also try to play bishop d2, trying to get a better pawn structure, but unfortunately for white, this tactically backfires. You simply take on c3, take on e4, and as it happens, white cannot take on e5, right? Why? Because after bishop e5, you already know the trick. Takes, takes, and queen f5 check. Once again, the king on e1 is targeted by this side check, and after c3, queen e5, black is simply up a piece. Alright, perhaps knight f3 once again is not a very impressive retreat, but where to go? A very tempting square for white to consider is knight f5, right? White is thinking about playing something like knight e6 check, or maybe even there could be knight e3, knight e5, so why not consider? But again, white is not in time to do this. So you can play knight f6, immediately challenge the pawn on e4 and threaten to push d5. And if white plays knight c3, here you see bishop b4 is not very good, right? The pawn on g7 is under attack, so the knight on f5 has some pros. It's not all that bad, but now after d5, you see there's the downside of white's plan. Now the knight on f5 is immediately challenged by your light square bishop. So for example, white takes it, we take on f5, white takes it, we take it, here, b takes. So once again, we have a healthy development and we have a center. So white could play something like this, knight e3, bishop g6, bishop c4, here, short castle. And long castle looks very aggressive, because if we immediately take control of the d file, we secure our queenside weaknesses, and by moves like rook h to e8, knight e4, knight e2, black once again is looking for ways to take over the game. Alright, knight f5, not really impressive. What else? What else can be done? White can also try to retreat with the knight on e2, which sometimes in some Sicilians is a good idea. The knight might go to g3, but again, your idea is going to be quite similar. So we are going to play here bishop c5. The idea is target the pawn on f2 as quickly as possible. Let's say white here plays knight g3. We play queen b6, attacking the pawn on f2. And after queen d2, h5. Now suddenly h4 is a very annoying threat. I mean, the knight on g3 gone, white will have some problems to protect the pawn on e4. So for example, h4 makes sense. Now we play knight f6, knight c3, and knight g4. Even more pressure to the pawn on f2. And after knight e1, d6, white pushes our knight back. But now you see white has major issues to finish the development of his king, because short castle seems to be impossible. We have a monster bishop on the long diagonal, and you just casually continue normal development by bishop e6 and I guess short castle and perhaps even d5. So doesn't look very impressive. Here white also has access to knight c3. And after knight c3, perhaps there's a small trick, by the way. Watch out. After queen b6, we carry out the same idea to target the pawn on f2 with a bishop and a queen. But after bishop e3, make sure you don't miss this. Takes. The pawn on e3, you cannot do this. You cannot take this pawn. Because after knight e5, your queen on e3 will be under attack. There's a major threat to deliver you a fork on c7. But white has committed himself to some weaknesses, and they're not going to disappear. So we can simply play knight f6. The pawn on e3 now is under attack. Queen d2. The pawn on b2 seems to be, again, quite risky to take. So instead, we can focus on our development. d6. Very nice move. And after the long castle, bishop e6. And white is pretty much never in time to take this pawn on d6, which we would actually happily trade. For example, here for the pawn on e3, which would give us very nice control of the dark squares. For example, white plays knight g3, we play a long castle, and again, we are having a very good game. So perhaps something like king b8, and you can also start active operations at the queen side. So we are going to go back to this position and wonder what else is left among the rare moves, rare knight moves. And probably also it makes sense to check knight takes on c6. Right, so white acknowledges, all right, you got me, I want to trade the knights. Now, here we are going to be play ambitious. Instead of the d takes on c6, we take b takes on c6, and the idea is at some point go for an active d5 push in the center, thus securing black a very good pawn center. White once again has a number of moves. Knight c3, bishop c4, and bishop d3. For example, white plays bishop c4. After bishop c4, now d5 is not going to happen, at least not immediately. So we bring out our dark square bishop here. And instead of the casual development like knight f6, we can actually be ambitious. We can play queen h4, which looks a bit strange, right? But the thing is, we might be threatened with knight f6 and knight g4. And suddenly there's some very serious pressure against white's pawn on h2 and f2. For example, knight c3 and knight f6. And now the question is how white is going to react against the knight g4 threat. Plus, by the way, also the pawn on e4 is under attack. So for example, white tries to play g3. Queen h3, knight g4 is still a threat. And after queen f3, instead of the normal short castle, we can be ambitious. h5, threading h4, opening the h-file. Queen g2 seems to be necessary, and after take h4. Black is getting a very dynamic game. For example, bishop g5, h3 check, king h1, and a5. So we want to play moves like rook b8, bishop d4, targeting the pawn on e4, d6, probably already king e7 will be necessary at some point. You can forget about castling short, and black's pieces simply look better. instead of queen f3, here, white, instead of g3, white can also play queen f3. But now after queen f3, we have a very, very nice move d5. The point is, if white here plays intermezzo move g3, we suddenly have surprise move bishop g4, takes on h4, bishop takes on f3, black simply dominates the center. And after queen g2, queen h5, bishop f3 is unstoppable. Very, very nice idea. And it's not clear what white should do against this idea. So after d5, probably white has to take. But now we take on c4. White simply loses a piece. Right? So this again is not very good for white. So queen f3 leads nowhere. Right. Instead of bishop c4, there's also some other moves. For example, white could just continue normal development and play bishop d3. Bishop d3, bishop c5, here, knight f6, we just play casual development, knight c3, a5, try to gain more space at the queen side, and now white needs to figure out what is he going to do with his development. For example, he plays here queen e2. a4 is a very popular idea in modern chess because black takes a lot of space advantage at the queen side. So bishop e3 might be necessary, takes, and queen a5. Now we are threatening to play a3 and target the knight on c3. So a3 seems to be again a necessary move, and after a couple of logical moves, white is simply experiencing some issues with pawn on b2. This is also one of the ideas why we did push a5, a4 very quickly. So let's go back instead of the queen e2. White also has bishop g5. You might already remember this idea from other chapters. Now we deal with this by playing h6. Bishop h4 is very tempting, but now remember, we haven't yet short castle, the white knight is not on f3, and we can play g5, we are not afraid of any sacrifices on g5. Bishop g3, and simply secure ourselves with d6. And now you look at the position, you start to wonder, what is this white's dark square bishop doing on g3? Not much. Knight a4, we have to retreat, c4. White's idea is to play c5, with the idea to get to the pawn on e5, so we have to react pretty quickly. h5 is very nice, threatening h4, trap the bishop, h3, h4, bishop h2, g4, and you have suddenly a very strong attack. And after h4, there's knight g4, even more. And now, h takes on g5, h4 is going to be a major threat. And again, white is not very happy, probably with the dynamics that black has in this position. So we are going to go back once again to this position where white played bishop c4. We had a look at bishop d3 as well. Probably knight c3 has to be done. Now after knight c3, we simply play bishop c5. Again, we develop the bishop first. So here, for example, white plays bishop c4. We have a very, very cute idea. You might remember already some ideas from previous lines. d5, surprisingly this works. Now the point is, after e takes on d5, we give a check. White has to take, otherwise the king is walking for no good reason. Queen h4 check, and now you start to see why we're doing this. The white king is exposed. We win the bishop on c4. And after queen c4, d takes on c6, knight f6, the white king is incredibly weak. Let's summarize slightly what we learned in this chapter. Now we are moving on to the mainstream theory of the Sicilian Kalashnikov, which starts with c5, knight c6, white opts for the open Sicilian, we play e5, and in this chapter we checked all the other retreats with the white knight. Of course the main move is knight b5, but here we check every single other move. And white has the other responses like knight b3, knight f5, knight f3, knight e2, none of them, they look really convincing. And partly because of the reason that very often your response is playing very quickly knight f6, d5, and bishop b4. For example, as seen in this line, knight b3, knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4 here, and d5. Immediately solving all the opening problems and already getting a better position. Sometimes there are some exceptions, like with knight e2. Here, instead of the d5, you can bother white by going after this pawn. Think about bishop c5, queen b6, immediately applying the pressure. And also after knight takes on c6, you don't rush with d5. First, you wait for white to play the very obvious move, bishop c4, only then to surprise white with a tactical shot of bishop f2, queen h4, and again getting a great position.
Access ChessEnigma's free sample lessons. Enjoy videos, interactive exercises, and a digital board to practice anywhere on any device. Sign up for free and start improving your chess from home today.